We're going to talk a bit today about what's wrong, actually, in both public perception and policy narratives on how to solve climate change. You know, if you ask the average person on the street, and surveys illustrate this, they believe that tackling climate change is going to incur either a lot of personal sacrifice, cost at the household level, or cost at the national budget. And you know, the policy direction has really entrenched the idea of a tax being associated with the green transition, which is both poor politics and actually poor economics as well, which Larry Summers also alluded to earlier. So in tackling any problem, you start with understanding the nature of it. You know, we've developed this sort of three-part trichotomy. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but we think it does work and it has some logic to it. In collapsing emissions, in fully decarbonizing our economy, there are three types of things we need to do. The first is where we have technologies and they are affordable. So most renewable technologies sit in this category already. And we just need to make the maths work. We just need to allocate as much capital and make sure the projects, the return on the investment is more than the cost of capital so that those projects make money. That's all we need to do for simple maths. The second is mini-musks. Musks come up a lot today, maybe for good reason. We need more mad entrepreneurs who are willing to throw a lot of money at solving problems where the technology isn't yet mature enough or isn't down the cost curve. So this might be green, low-carbon cement, genuinely low-carbon sustainable aviation fuel, for example. We need more R&D investment in these topics. And then finally, herding sheep. At a recent conference, a behavioral change economist reacted quite badly to the herding sheep. He felt it was quite patronizing, but I maintain all of us are hugely influenced by social norms and by what the rest of us do. So herding sheep type challenges are where we need to change behavior, change diets, which has again come up a lot today, reduce flying. Now, critically, when you look at the maths of what it takes to both halve emissions by 2030, which is what we have to do to hit our climate goals, and then get to net zero by 2050, roughly 70% of the problem, 70% of those emissions are in electrification of transport, buildings, and manufacture, and running that grid off sustainable energy. And that's really good because we have those technologies, basically. That sits in the simple maths category. It's also good because in doing so, we are creating wealth for the country. That is not money down the drain. When thinking about policy prescriptions, it's also always worth asking what's worked. So we look at a few success stories. Solar PV, again, it's already been mentioned today. Huge amount of subsidies from the Chinese, the Japanese, the Germans in the 1990s and the noughties. Collapsed the cost of solar PV. It's now the cheapest form of electricity in history. It's an extraordinary success story in driving it down the cost curve. UK offshore wind. You know, wind now makes up about 25% of UK electricity provision. It's scaled enormously over the last 10 years. And this is an example of really making the simple maths work. The UK provided contracts for difference, essentially guaranteed a price to those project developers to make sure that the economics would work for them of those wind projects. And then finally, you know, the Norwegian car sales, 90 to 95% are currently electric or hybrid, and it's an extraordinary success story in scaling EV sales. There's similar case examples in some Chinese cities, some of the other Scandinavian nations. So what do these all have in common? They all have positive incentives at the heart of them. And we, slightly tongue-in-cheek, coined this idea of epics, but it seems to have stuck. And now the Economist is talking about epics, so that's good. Extreme positive incentives for change. And that was what we identified as the common thread of these success stories. We made for the user, be it a consumer, be it an industry, be it a corporate buyer, the financial positive extreme to adapt to a substitute. So just stepping back a few initial learnings. Behavior change can be difficult if you don't identify the right levers. But actually, when you identify and generate a substitute and make it cheaper, that behavior change happens very rapidly and at scale. So we really need to think about generating substitutes and making them cheaper, sector by sector. And we've done that in some sectors, but we need to take it systematically. This also makes clear that the role of tax is secondary. And again, Larry Summers touched on this, that we've been very focused on externalities in this debate over the last few decades. And we joke that's the wrong chapter of the economics textbook. We should be looking at the chapter on the price elasticity of demand. We should be trying to understand, first of all, what does it take to change a decision from the high carbon option to the low carbon option. And taxes, of course, will play a role, but they're not the sole goal. Just hand over to Eric.
Great. I just want to quickly draw, Corinne, in typical style, has delivered very lucidly and very clearly what seems like a very compelling set of arguments, and we can nod along in agreement. It's worth just pointing out, though, how radically at odds this soft-spoken message is to the prevailing narrative on climate change. Most people's perception on the prevailing narrative of climate change is really about two things. One is that it's wholesale lifestyle change. Well, actually, if you think about what Corinne's described, there's no lifestyle change. We're talking about making our grids sustainable, which is capital investment spending in green energies and the technologies that we've already heard about. It's about transport becoming electrified, houses being electrified, and manufacturing. I haven't made any changes to my lifestyle, and we've collapsed 75% of emissions. That is radically at odds with how most people think about climate change in our society, and that is our first challenge. We have to change the narrative. The second thing is none of those success stories involve taxation. And yet, if you think about policy across the developed world today, most people's association is green with tax. Right? That is catastrophic political economy, right? That is fueling, appropriately in this context, populism, which we have to combat. And it's also really bad economics, because if we look at the success stories, none of them were premised on carbon taxes. So that is really an absolutely critical component of our argument. The final point I just want to make with respect to that is everything that Corinne has described is asset creation. We just saw the wind farms in the UK being described as strategic assets. So actually, the green transition is about investment spending. It is not about a huge cost. It's about radically changing the capital base of our economies. That's why we have in this picture here the difference between going on a holiday on the credit card and doing an extension with a buy-to-let mortgage, or doing a buy-to-let with a mortgage, right? The latter is investment spending, where your return on capital is whether or not you're creating wealth depends on the return on capital versus the cost of capital. It is much more analogous to that sort of investment spending, what we are describing. And that is another absolutely critical part of the narrative, is it remains the case, despite inflation, despite high interest rates, that the state today can borrow at extraordinarily a low cost of capital. So, for example, the United Kingdom today, 10-year gilts are still yielding less than 2.5%. What does that mean? That means that the UK government could borrow for capital expenditure in our energy infrastructure at an interest rate below 2.5%, fixed for a decade. Now, the return on wind farms is more like 6 to 8%. If you look at the return on offshore wind, it's 6 to 8%. So that isn't a cost, that's actually a huge wealth-creating opportunity. In fact, it's not just an appalling state of affairs that we're destroying the planet, it's an appalling state of affairs that we're missing on a huge opportunity to create wealth for ourselves and for future generations. Okay, so if we take that backdrop, the prevailing narrative is wrong. This is about capital investment. We have to think very carefully about how we're going to use taxes here, because there has been no role of carbon taxes in the dramatically huge successes in solar, in wind farms, in behavioral change, if you look at the case of Norway with electric vehicles. So what principles should we be thinking about throughout our policies? And again, I think this is an area where the movement has let us down. There's been a big failure in being realistic about the principles of motivations of the different actors and how they affect policy. So humans only change their behavior if the alternative is cheaper, better, or their friends are doing it, right? We know that from behavioral psychology. So any policy we look at has to have those criteria, right? Businesses will only change their behavior, let's be realistic about it, if they think they can make more money or if they're forced to do so by regulations. And politicians, to state the blindingly obvious, need to get elected. We need to come up with policies that are popular. We do not need to come up with policies that give momentum to populism. In conclusion, carbon taxes are the wrong chapter of the textbook, right? Which is not to say that taxes don't have any role, but they need to be sequenced. Right? If you look at the history of carbon taxes, it's very interesting. Part of the reason they were actually used by governments is precisely because they don't change behavior. Now, that may seem counterintuitive, but that's why they're a great means of raising revenue. By contrast, if you create a substitute, i.e. you target the relative price, you can get a dramatic change in behavior. And that's what we talk about. Make the green option cheaper. That has to be the guiding principle. If we actually want to achieve anything, we must make the green option cheaper. Let me give two very clear examples on this. Right? The United Kingdom has one of the highest levels of fuel duty, right, for passenger vehicles. Right? So we pay very, very high fuel taxes, but we have one of the lowest penetration rates of electric vehicles. Right? That's a good example of how carbon taxes work in practice and don't deliver what we want. They're not changing behavior. They're just generating a lot of revenue for the government. Okay? If you contrast that with the Norwegian example that Corinne gave, where they're targeting the relative price using an epic, they price the vehicle. So in Norway, if you go into a car dealership, the electric vehicle is priced at a huge discount, 20% discount, to the fossil fuel vehicle. Well, why would you buy a petrol vehicle if the electric vehicle is cheaper? And lo and behold, you're getting 90% of car sales in Norway are electric vehicles. We know how to do this if we look at the examples. So it's all about applying extreme positive incentives to create that differential. Somebody referred earlier to plant-based burgers, but there's a very simple question for me. Why, when you go into McDonald's or Burger King, isn't the plant-based burger 20 or 30% cheaper? It's more expensive. Right? And so this can be applied sector by sector, and if we really want to change behavior. Finally, we have the lowest cost of capital in generations. We've put still in inverted commas, despite the inflation, despite interest rates going up, the governments across the developed world can borrow at negative real interest rates, even using expected inflation rather than current inflation rates. And you get a positive real return from these investments. In summary, we need to change the narrative because people have the wrong narrative. We need to have policies designed which are going to be popular. Right? And we need policies to be designed that are actually going to be successful and work.
I think we're moving to a panel now. Yeah.